Professor Bertucci herself is no stranger to Florence, not only because this is not her first time that she gives a talk at the UI, but also because she works as a curator. And if you go downtown to the Galileo Museum, you will be able to see two rooms full of pretty strange machines and all sorts of devices, which she curated. As a curator, one of her most recent projects was related to the renovation and sort of reimagination of Yale University's own museum, the Peabody Museum, where she curated the museum's very first collection on the history of science and technology. And now it is to this field of the material that there's one organizational matter that I need to mention. Many of you will know that Professor Bertucci is here at the UI for 2 days, and tomorrow she's doing a masterclass on the materiality of science and on museum collections, specifically on how to squeeze out more information from museum collections. That is more than what is already on the labels. And this masterclass will take place in the Hemeroteca just across the cloister tomorrow at 10. So keep an eye out because the university website has a typo. It doesn't start at 9, it starts at 10, just across. And this masterclass, if you have any questions about it, you can direct it to Raffaele here because he's going to be chairing the session tomorrow. Now, about today's lecture, that title, which is Science and the Innovation of European Modernity. Professor Bertucci will be focusing more on the rhetoric of science, the rhetoric of modernity, and how science and technology were sort of deployed in order to exert European dominance over the world. We will start with a lecture, and then, as usual, it will be followed by a Q&A, and I'll start taking questions during the lecture already. So if something comes to your mind, then try to catch my attention and I'll put you into the queue. Now, with this, I would like to give the field over to Professor Bertucci.
Thank you very much for that generous introduction. Thank you to Claudia for the wonderful organization, and thank you all for being here. It's a real pleasure to present this lecture here. What does it mean to be modern? I'm not sure what is the first thing that is crossing your mind right now. But if you asked this question in an academic context during the early modern period, roughly between 1500 and 1800, you would be entering a heated intellectual debate that introduced some key connections that today we take for granted. One is the connection of modernity with science and technology. The other is the idea that knowledge is cumulative, that it grows over time. I am especially interested in how these notions of modernity, which implied that being modern meant to be more advanced, also implicitly connected modernity with Europe at a time of colonial expansion and of human trafficking at a large scale. I am also particularly interested in how these ideologies spread through the public by means of educational pastimes that normalize the notions of European superiority and dominance over the world. So let's start with the association of modernity with cumulative knowledge, something that we really take for granted, that it may be difficult for those of you who are not historians and not historians of the early modern period to grapple with, because it seems so obvious. And yet, up until the Renaissance, a main motif among scholars was the idea of lost knowledge. They believed that what the ancients knew was to a large extent lost in the present day, in their present day. Making knowledge, producing knowledge for them meant to retrieve knowledge that went lost over time. It was therefore a past-oriented endeavor based on the notion that the past was an epistemic reservoir made largely inaccessible by the passing of time and the lack of technologies for preserving memory, in particular, the printing press, which the ancients, of course, didn't have. In the latter part of the 16th century, the Italian jurist Guido Panciroli created a list of remarkable inventions. In fact, he created two lists in 2 volumes of remarkable inventions, in which he compared the ones that got lost since antiquity to the present, to his present, and those that the present era had gained. The comparison demonstrated that the lost inventions were many more than the recent ones. It was one of the many scathing reminders of the glorious and lost achievements of the past, ranging from natural substances such as the purple dye and asbestos, to inventions such as malleable glass and the famous Archimedes burning mirrors. You can be familiar with the story of Archimedes burning the enemy's ships through the use of these burning mirrors in Syracuse. A different perspective than this one was offered by the Flemish artist Johannes Stradanus, who worked for the Medici family in Florence, whose Nova Reperta, you see the first plate here, emphasized the new discoveries of the modern age. Now, the Nova Reperta is a series of 20 prints that celebrated inventions. What you're looking at is the first of this print that works also as a title page. And so you see in this very rhetorical print, the argument of the book. On the top left, you see the new that enters, pointing to America, of course, newly known to Europeans, and the compass to the right side, presumably invented in Amalfi in the recent era. At the bottom, you have, in the middle between those 2 circles, you see the printing press, the mother of memory, and therefore the idea that you can build on the knowledge of the past. And on the right top corner, you have the old that goes away. So this is a visual argument, we say. This print is making an argument that celebrates inventions that are represented in each of the other 19 plates. And you see the kind of inventions represented at the bottom. So you have mechanical clocks, you have gunpowder, you have distillation, and other technologies. So this work captured another approach to the present, which celebrated science, technology, and the crafts as engines of modernity. The term nova, of course, new discoveries, sometimes translated as new inventions, points to the fact that we are now looking at the future and the novelties of what these innovations have brought. The comparison between the relative merits of the present, the moderns, and the past, the ancients, was a recurring theme in early modern intellectual milieus, but it became the topic of a very heated controversy over the course of the 17th century. Then the debate on the relative merits of the ancients versus the moderns really exploded, especially in France. The debate was labeled Querelle des anciens et des modernes and has been discussed by various scholars. It sparked within the Académie Française, the arbiter of the French language among many other things, because of a poem that was read that celebrated the era of Louis XIV as the best time in history. And these elicited some reservations, when not outright objections, by the supporters of antiquity as this time of unsurpassed achievements, both in the realms of poetry, rhetoric, eloquence, and other things that the present, the moderns, could not aspire to achieve at their same level. So the Querelle des anciens et des modernes started as a debate on rhetoric and eloquence, but it soon went well beyond those domains and even well beyond France itself. Jonathan Swift, whom I'm sure you know, famous British playwright, satirized the Querelle, produced a booklet called The Battle of the Books. You see an engraving from the work, in which he staged, and of course he didn't take sides, but he made fun of the very fact that these scholars, these intellectuals, were actually debating this thing, and that for them was so serious. So he imagined that there was an actual battle between ancient books and modern books that took place within the King's Library at St. James Palace. So you really have the books fighting, and there are other metaphors interwoven within this story. But the thing is, this querelle was not just an academic querelle. It was really something that went beyond the ivory tower to include the so-called Republic of Letters in Europe at the time, where the stakes were really the definition of modernity, among other things. Now, the scholars who have worked on this controversy have pointed that de facto, the ancients and the moderns, the supporters of the ancients and the supporters of the moderns, shared more than they wanted to admit, including their own relationship to the past. They both parties respected and admired antiquity. So what was really the contentious matter? According to these scholars, the contentious matter was the notion of progress. For the moderns, the present was superior to any other time in history. Now, I build on this work to argue that the moderns' notion of progress was firmly rooted in their views of science and technology and in their views of what the histories of science and technology were. To give you an example, I'm going to mention Charles Perrault, the initiator of the Querelle des anciens et des modernes in 1687, who was a staunch supporter of the moderns. He underscored that mechanics, the science of mechanics, made what most of its fellow arts do only by allusion and metaphor. He reminded his readers that the moderns were now able not only to do anything that the ancients did, but the moderns had also recently built machines and fountains that the ancients could only conceive of in their imagination. The example was ready in the minds of his peers, he knew, but he mentioned it explicitly. It was Versailles. Versailles was a wonder of modern technology. It became this wonderful place after being a swampy land. And the transformation was possible because of machines including the extraordinary Machine de Marly, a gigantic pump that brought water to Versailles from the river some miles away. So it was this machine that was very recent and built on purpose for Versailles that transformed a swampy land into the pinnacle of French refinement and luxury. The point that the reference to science and technology helped Perrault bring home was that knowledge was cumulative and grew over time. It did not get lost. The ancients, for example, lacked the necessary knowledge to improve technology that had accumulated over time. The Greek poets, think of the Iliad, for example, and this is what Perrault is saying his readers, sung about imaginary moving stones and walking trees. But the formidable machines employed at Versailles had actually lifted heavy rocks and successfully transplanted and aligned very tall trees. Perrault discussed also optics, and you see a plate from a publication by Perrault, as a science that had roots in antiquity, yet only in modern times brought about optical instruments such as the telescope and the microscope, which had made the most extraordinary achievements in natural knowledge possible. Just to remind those of you who may not know, the telescope and the microscope were introduced over the course of the 17th century. So these were very, very recent innovations that had revealed extraordinary novelty. Galileo discovered Jupiter's satellites that were unknown to ancient astronomers, and through the microscope, microscopists like Robert Hooke in London had revealed that even insignificant small creatures like fleas were full of incredible details that only showed to the eye when looked at through the microscope. Almost in direct response to Panciroli's list, Perrault claimed that the moderns could replicate all that the ancients had. What went lost could either be replaced, and the example again was in the mind of everyone, the purple dye that got lost since antiquity could be replaced by cochineal, a red pigment that was produced from insects coming to Europe from the Americas. Or he also added, if they could not be replaced, they were not necessary after all. A lot of things that the ancients were after were pointless in modernity. So what these examples show is that the idea of knowledge as cumulative was gaining traction during this time, offering a morally viable alternative to the established notion of lost knowledge. They also show that science, technology, and the crafts were the founding bricks upon which such notion emerged. So one of the distinctive features of the debate was the sharpening of the definition of modern, which came to be understood even more clearly as the opposite of ancient. We find this, for example, codified in Diderot's and D'Alembert's Encyclopédie, where the very short definition of modern is what is new or recent in opposition to what is ancien, ancient. The dictionary of the French Academy presents the very same definition, specifying the modern meant new or recent in contrast with ancient or antique, even old. But perhaps no one expressed effectively the sense of superiority of the moderns than the French philosophe Voltaire. In Le Mondain, the Worldling, which he wrote published in 1736, he opposed the widespread conception of the prelapsarian state of nature as a golden age, so the Garden of Eden as the golden age, to the new Iron Age of modern Paris. And this is his own word, the Iron Age. Adam and Eve, Voltaire observed, were naked, they slept on the ground, and had dirty fingernails. Unaware of industry and comforts, their happiness was only due to their ignorance. By contrast, science, technology, and the arts had guided humanity towards an iron age of luxury, wealth, which had turned Paris into the new Eden. The enthusiasm for the present moment as a turning point in this imaginary yet consequential competition with the splendor of antiquity generated new old authorities. For example, physicians were called new Hippocrates. Apothecaries were called new Dioscorides. Naturalists were called new Plinies. And so many other new resurrected celebrities from antiquity demonstrated that the modern era had nothing to envy to the authorities of the past. Now, something that I really like is that this spread also to the world of the crafts. So it doesn't remain confined within the academic world. Ambitious makers of optical, astronomical, mathematical instruments appropriated the symbols of ancient ingenuity and recast them in their own terms. In London, several scientific instrument makers chose Archimedes as the sign of their shops. Archimedes, as explained in texts of the time, was, quote, such a great geometrician and admirable contriver that amongst all, he became a proverb for skill. When a thing was well and exquisitely done, they used to say, Archimedes couldn't have done better. As you can see in these trade cards, so these are sort of business cards that advertise the business of the particular optical instrument maker or mathematical instrument maker. These makers offered a kind of steampunk version of Archimedes. They reinvented him as a modern astronomer with a telescope in his hand. And in my favorite version, which is this one to your left, as an explorer in a domineering pose above the world. This was an explicit reminder of what the instruments that this maker crafted or traded helped the various European states achieve: global commerce, natural resource extraction, and colonial expansion. All of these things needed scientific instruments. And this is the argument these trade cards are making. So all these sources point to the central role that science, technology, and the crafts played in articulating notion of modernity, the very early notions of modernity. But when we look more deeply, we can recognize that in all these works that celebrated their present as new and better than the past, there was something distinctively European. We can go back to Stradamus. This is the plate that talks about the naming of America. It depicts Amerigo Vespucci in the process of naming America, represented as a naked woman on to the right. So you see the plate is visually split in two halves, where the half to the left represents the European technological advancements. You have navigation, you have Vespucci with his clothes and weapons. And to the right, you have a state of wilderness, where you have a scene of cannibalism on just above the personification of America and exotic animals in the wild. Now, what marks the distinction between the modern and the wild, which is equated in a sense to the before the modern, so in opposition to the modern this time, is a scientific instrument, the astrolabe, the mariner's astrolabe that Vespucci is holding in his hand. So that is the marker of the difference between Europe and America in this plate. Now, this is by no means the only visual source that represents these notions of European modernity versus the kind of state of the primitive state of the other continents. The visual, maps and other kind of cartographic and geographic material really convey that very same notion very effectively. I chose this particular piece that represents the world, the known world of the time. And what we may not pay attention to, which is the cartouche, the sort of frame all around, is not really a decoration. That's the whole point of the piece. You have, I'm going to discuss only the four continents at the corners, at the four corners. So you're supposed to look in a sort of clockwise movement. So you start with Europe, that is represented as a richly clothed woman. And then you move to Asia, that is similarly clothed, but less so. And then you move at the bottom to Africa, to America, and then Africa, that are represented naked and as bearers of those natural resources that Europe was using at the time. So these notions of European modernity predicated upon visions of scientific progress that normalized colonialism spread through European elites by means of educational pastimes like these, and others that are even more interesting. Playing cards, board games, illustrated compendia, and other educational toys relied on science and technology to convey notions of European superiority. Let me show you that. So this is a board game that you see in its full version to the left. And then I zoomed in the bottom and top portions. So it's called Temple, the road to the Temple of Honor and Fame. And it really represents the very tortuous path that children have to take to aspire to the Temple of Honor and Fame. And so you see the children entering the temple at the bottom. Then they progress through a series of activities, and some of which we will discuss. I call your attention to the globe, so the lesson of geography. Maybe I can point. No. Yeah. Okay. Here. And so most of these activities have to do with what we call practical mathematics: navigation, surveying, mining, geography, astronomy. These are all branches of what at the time was understood as mathematics. We also have playing cards like this, produced by a British maker of mathematical instruments called Thomas Tuttle. This was produced in 1701. These were 52 cards, each of which depicted one of the instruments that his workshop could produce or sell, from quadrants and cross staffs to sundials and globes. Yet, so one could understand this set of playing cards as a catalog for his business, which it definitely was. But in addition to depicting the instruments, some of the cards illustrate their use, the use of the instruments in a variety of professions and activities that were crucial to the British Empire, from mining to architecture, from shipbuilding to gunnery, from surveying to gardening. Mathematical knowledge and familiarity with mathematical instruments was a distinctive feature of the gentleman, as well as a useful background to serve the state. Players encountered this notion in the card entitled Mathematics. I think I have it here, whose caption reads, "By the assistance of a master, they, mathematical instruments, are made so delightful and pleasant and of such general use that they aggrandize a man for all conversations and make him capable of employ." We then move to the level where we read our glory, safety, the sheet. Our glory, safety, trade, and navigation wholly depend on our ships. They depend upon art, which not only enrich, but affords the greatest defense. And of course, this is, and if you're curious what the level says, it is an instrument used in draining bogs and mines, unwatering fens, making rivers navigable, supplying town with water, etc. So by playing with this set, not only did users, often children, get familiar with the variety of mathematical instruments and their use, but they also learned to understand such objects as markers of the superiority of European culture across the world. Learning mathematics enabled European young men, and the gender is deliberate, to exert dominance over nature and, by extension, over peoples on Earth. As other London mathematical instrument makers, Tuttle offered instructions on the use of mathematical instruments in his shop or in the homes of those who requested his lectures. At this time, it was very popular to attend lectures on scientific subjects for fun, for uplifting, for entertainment. And so Tuttle was one of many who offered and lived on this kind of public lectures that he offered to people of either sex above the age of 12. Learned elites, which it should be noted, encompassed craftspeople as well as aristocrats and merchants, encountered this kind of worldviews linking progress and scientific instrumentation in a variety of other educational objects. My favorite is the peep show. The peep show, so on the left is a rendering, is not an early modern print, but it gives you an idea of how the peep show that you see on the right, surviving one from an exhibition I co-curated, worked. So you have a box, sometimes it's decorated, if it is for the aristocracy, other times, more often, it's just a cardboard box with a lens through which you peep in. And by peeping in, you see the object to the right, that is a series of paper cut so as to create the sense of depth, as if in a theater. As it in a stage. And so often these peep shows depict cities that these children or adults would never see. This is one of the ways in which they get a visual sense of what other worlds may look like. Some other times, like in this case, they depicted for fun scenes like this, sugar plantation with an enslaved person and his master ready to beat him. So it's very interesting that these kind of objects that are entertaining, they depict and normalize and make people indifferent, users indifferent to the kind of violence that they present. The last set of objects that I'd like to discuss with you today is probably the object that came to embody, maybe more than anything else, notions of European dominance. And this is the pair of terrestrial and celestial globes. Globes were widely used, spectacular objects at the intersection of art and science. John Locke, who believed that geography was the science of princes, referred to globes as tools that made the king realize, quote, how large a part of mankind is now waiting on your determinations and must receive benefits or suffer evils as your influence is extended or withdrawn, end quote. Globes were used to learn geography and astronomy and were often represented in 17th and 18th century paintings or prints representing a learning scene. And so you have here a Flemish portrait to the left, the family of Gronovius from 1775, and to the right, the famous painting Lesson of Geography by Pietro Longhi that you can see in Venice at the Museo Corre. There are other representations like this, where to the left, you have the frontispiece from a book entitled The Young Gentleman and Lady's Philosophy on Science. This is a book that makes science accessible to a large audience. And the frontispiece is a scene in which a young lady is learning from a male tutor, and you see the globe represented along with the telescope. And to the right is a family portrait in which the globes, both terrestrial and celestial, have really center stage. And you see the young boy in particular using the globe with a compass. The globe was used, not just looked at, but used to learn astronomy and geography. The English diarist and naval administrator Samuel Pepys purchased globes to study mathematics, geography, and astronomy with his wife. And in 1663, we learn from his diary that the couple included discussing globes in their after-supper routine. The English poet John Milton, who advised the students to read classical authorities on topics such as agriculture, recommended that they should instead turn to the moderns when it came to the use of the globes. By the 18th century, there hardly was a good library in Britain and the rest of Europe without a pair of globes. Librarians had to budget large amounts for these expensive objects that had to periodically be replaced when regularly used, because they got worn, not just by handing with the hands, but also the use of the compass. To give you an example, the librarian of the Bodleian Library in Oxford reluctantly purchased the first pair, thinking that no one would actually use them, and had to change his mind very quickly when he noticed that the students constantly reserved the globes. It was a new science. It gave you a sense of the reshaping of geography and one of the very few ways in which you got a sense of what the Earth looked like, inhabited or not. We have maps and Google Earth. It's difficult for us to think about the power of these objects to materialize visions and worldviews in their own time. Beyond the educational principles, Locke himself exalted the globes as particularly useful for the education of children. Their figures and shapes pleased the eye, he said, and facilitated memorization. What were children exactly supposed to memorize? Now, let's look at the globes. They were three-dimensional objects that gave a sort of God's view on the earth and the heavens. Often made and purchased in pairs, they represented the earth and the heavens in the same size, reifying, in the case of the celestial globe, something that didn't quite exist. There is no celestial globe. There is no boundary of the universe, even though it does appear as a sphere to us. But the fact that the celestial globe represented constellation and its surface gave the user the impression that they were together with God looking from outside, something that shouldn't have any outside. So this global view that globes materialize is quite intriguing to dissect and analyze. In 1606, Nathaniel Carpenter, one of the first English geographers to include the use of the globe in his textbooks, stated that the northern hemisphere was the masculine part of the earth, whereas the southern hemisphere was the feminine. And of course, with that gendering of the globe came the qualities associated with them. So the northern hemisphere was stronger, worthier, and greater. The southern hemisphere, being feminine, was deficient and wanting in this perfection. And so this is a quote from him: "The two hemispheres suffer a great and noble disparity. The inhabitants of the southern hemisphere are of a brutish disposition." So this is a textbook. This is what children were encountering in the textbooks while using these beautiful objects and expensive objects. Together with methods for timekeeping, astronomical and geographical notions, the global view the globes projected included notions of human difference that organized the world in a hierarchical order among the various kinds of humans and between the sexes. With the expansion of colonialism and global trade, European globes became legitimizing tools through which the powerful and their subjects understood their place in the universe. And this is another of my favorite objects. It's a pocket globe. It's 3-inch, almost 10 centimeters in diameter. And it is a terrestrial globe that has a celestial globe that encloses it. So when you hold the pocket globe, you have the entire universe in your hand. What is intriguing is that the terrestrial globe, not just in the pocket globe, not just in this model, often represent itineraries of great so-called explorers, James Cook voyages, and others across the globe. And so this particular one presents lands unknown to Europeans as newly discovered James Cook voyage, Hansen voyage, and then the new indigenous lands are presented as new Europe. So you have New France, New Holland, New Britain, and then in Africa, the country of the Hottentots, very disparaging term. I give you some more example. This goes into the 19th century. This is a 19th century terrestrial globe, and in the cartouche where the maker presents his work, he makes a point of explaining that this particular globe represents the itinerary of Captain Cook, etc. Another example in the cartouche this is an 18th century example, presents the 4 continents in the dedication to the patron. And so this is an act on the part of the maker of presentation of his own work as speaking directly to the colonial ambitions of the patron. So as you see in these objects, the celebratory imaginary of discovery and exploration concealed the brutal reality of conquest and violence. This approach characterized even more celestial globes, in particular, the historical process of naming the southern constellations, of course, in a European context. If the southern hemisphere on the terrestrial globe was feminized and represented as awaiting conquest and domination, on the celestial globe, the southern hemisphere came to be understood as an uncharted sea to explore and conquer. As on the terrestrial globe, exploration was carried out by means of astronomical and surveying instruments, while conquest was operated by the process of naming. As trade companies established maritime routes connecting Northern Europe to the Southern Hemisphere, astronomers traveled aboard these companies' ships to explore the southern sky. Usually, the globes are decorated with constellations from antiquity. So you see in this example, I don't know what you can see, but you may be familiar with celestial globes. The constellations are represented for what they are. So, for example, in the zodiac, Pisces will be a fish, Cancer will be a crab, Libra will be a scale, and so on and so forth. So what happens when it comes to the southern sky? Astronomers, mostly from the Netherlands, Britain, and France, competed for the limited space on the surface of celestial globes. If you have to add new constellations, that is the surface you can feel, and there is so much you can do. And so there was another competition about what to put on this southern hemisphere. But take the 1597 globe by the Flemish Petrus Plancius, one of the founders of the Dutch East India Company. Using data from expeditions in Asia and Africa, Plancius created a celestial globe in collaboration with the cartographer Hondius, in which he represented the newly minted southern constellations. The southern sky became populated with exoticized humans and animals that reminded European elites of the lands and oceans that they learned to understand as new and discovered. The constellation that you see here, Indus, is still named like that. It was represented in this way, very stereotypical, and you find different representations depending on the cartographer that represented the constellation. Here you have another example. These are the gores. They are called gores. They're not cut yet, but basically the globe maker will cut these gores and glue them on a sphere. This is the southern hemisphere, and we see the new constellations that these Dutch astronomers represented. This is chameleon. This is bird of paradise, and then you can identify toucan, and in addition to Indus, and then there is the flying fish and others. So the southern hemisphere became, over the course of the 17th century, populated with these exotic animals that were familiar, in a sense, to Europeans, thanks to natural history books that described those very same animals as specifics to the lands they would never see. So the story of the southern sky and modernity, how modernity played out on the surface of celestial globes, is very interesting and gets really complicated with the case of this German astronomer Weigel, who decided that the ancient constellations, the classic constellations in the Northern Hemisphere, had to be completely renamed because they were out of date after the ruling houses of Europe. And so he presented this stunning sky, which he called the heraldic sky, and even made a globe that survives in which all the constellations are now reshaped and renamed after the ruling families in Europe. And this is the cartouche. But the end of the story of the Southern Hemisphere really needs to be with the astronomer Lacaille in France, who traveled to South Africa in the second half of the 18th century and identified 14 new constellations, which are still all there. And he named them after European modernity, the symbols of European modernity, the arts and the sciences. So you have constellations like the telescope, you have constellations like the microscope. Let's see what we can see. You have the sextant. So he got rid of the approach of antiquity and his contemporaries, who were naming new constellations after ruling houses or specific kings, and decided to go after these more self-evident, in a sense, celebration of modernity, which was hailed by the French Academy of Sciences because of the universal value of this constellation. In the Encyclopédie, the article on constellation celebrated Lacaille's version because they say the ancient Greek and Roman poets had derived absurd and bizarre fairy tales from ancient theologies that resulted in those constellations. By contrast, the new enlightened constellation of Lacaille were modern and scientific. To conclude, seemingly innocent devices used for educational pastime played a crucial role in spreading hard-to-correct supremacist worldviews. Objects of the kind I have discussed, crafted for scientific education or rational entertainment, normalized European colonialism and the connected notion of European dominance upon the world as an expression of modernity. They glossed over land dispossession and violence as needed pathways to progress. George Adams, the maker of the globe you're looking at that embraced Lacaille's constellation, he was scientific instrument maker to the British King George III, equated in the presentation of his new globe, British colonial expansion with what he called the diffusion of happiness. Colonization, he explained, would bring, quote, plenty of cultivated lands, the pleasures of society, the security of the law, and the light of revelation to those who now range the woods for prey and live at the mercy of winds and seasons. This is the kind of lesson users of all ages would draw from scientific instruments like celestial and terrestrial globes and educational pastimes like board games, peep shows, and playing cards. These objects were technologies of the self, the useful term introduced by Michel Foucault to indicate the habitual actions and rituals through which humans define themselves. The self that these objects defined through playing and entertaining was as European and modern as it was oblivious to the human costs of the wealth, education, and luxury embodied in these objects. Thank you.